Hi, this is Brian Apavu. It is Saturday, September 20th, 2025. Thought I'd record some thoughts today. Right now, I think in the United States, I think there's a lot of aftermath. Still, there's a lot of cultural aftermath after the shooting and assassination of Charlie Kirk. And I talked about that a little bit last week in terms of, how we're seeing each other experience empathy in different ways right now. And we are also just not comprehending each other. And this really has to do with where we are in terms of critical thinking, our thought processes, the way we communicate with each other, and so forth. I think one of the things that is becoming a hot topic at the present is the idea of free speech and where we are now and where we're going. So one of the major topics of conversation over this last week is that there's a particular late night TV host, Jimmy Kimmel, who was fired from ABC over remarks that he made regarding the Charlie Kirk assassination, Donald Trump, the motive of the killer, and also I think probably, or it seems like there's this is one component of a reflection of different. It's one component of a number of things he's said over the last couple of years that have sort of led to this, as well as other things like he's got a decline in his ratings, and I think overall there aren't that many people who are watching late night television at major networks anymore. I will speak for myself that we are, I really haven't watched major networks in a really long time. It's been a long time, and our family got rid of cable, so we're not really watching ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox. They're just things we don't watch. And every once in a while, I just because I still have a little bit of an interest in professional sports. Whenever there's major NFL or NBA playoff games, I'll get my subscriptions back and log back in. But even then, I just think that there's, I feel like what I'm watching, especially when it comes to the commercials and things like that, is just a reflection of a lot of propaganda. The news outlets, the commercials, I just feel like I'm in the midst of major propaganda. I definitely feel this kind of sense of propaganda while I'm watching a lot of these shows and the commercials and everything. And one of the things I find fascinating to me is that I've watched. I'm 41 years old. I've watched. I know who Jimmy Kimmel is. I know who Stephen Colbert is. I know who Jimmy Fallon is. I watched these people when they were, doing their original things. I mean, Jimmy Kimmel was on the Man Show. Stephen Colbert had his own Colbert Report, and prior to that, he was on the Daily Show. Jimmy Fallon was on SNL. I mean, these are pretty talented individuals. If you look at over the course of their career, they're very talented in terms of their capacity to be creative, to express comedy. If you can't, they early in their career just demonstrated that extremely well, that cleverness and wittiness about them. And what they inevitably do is they take on these major roles in these large organizations, and they're a shell of their own creativity, and they're just not funny or anything like that. And I don't think it's necessarily like a talent issue. I think it's just that they're bound by the organization that they're in. And I think when it comes to Charlie Kirk, and not Charlie Kirk. When it comes to the recent, when it comes to working with these large organizations, they are bound by being politically correct, by being by not offending too many individuals, and that's where what they end up saying is exceptionally filtered. So I think that that's largely a reflection of what we're seeing right now in media, in mainstream media. It's just these people take these big jobs and then they're just not funny because they're bounded to not be creative, not have anything original. And it's just, they're not just that interesting anymore. I think a lot of people particularly on the left, are kind of outraged by Jimmy Kimmel getting fired. He, ABC, which is now owned by Disney, fired him. I think there's some concern that there were affiliates that are affiliated with, that are worried about how the FCC might come down on them, and so they decided to terminate his show to avoid, the consequences of some issues that the organization and the television network would have with the FCC. Now, what does that sort of tell you about free speech? I mean, like I think the major organizations are bound by the FCC because they're on public broadcast networks and they're supposed to be, publicly neutral, I guess, for lack of a better word. And I think that is that's something that's like practically, I think that just tells you if the FCC can regulate these things, irregardless of what political group, what political affiliation or the FCC is currently aligned with, like, what do they tell you about free speech within these networks? I mean, you're not going to have it. You just don't have it. And that's why there's a lack of creativity from these individuals who are talking on these networks, and they're not creative. And that's not because they're talentless. They're not able to. I mean, they're probably getting a ton of money to take these positions, but they're not able to do. They're just not able to be very creative. I think you see this with large organizations too, just even, in just the corporate world. Like, people can be creative and successful in a lot of things, and they can have a lot of opinions, but as they climb, organizational ladders, they're bound by, what they climb up to, and then, they can only say so much, even though they might have a lot of, opinions or unique opinions, or they might end up with some modification of their opinions based on mimetic desires as they, take on their desires, take on and shape the whatever new position they have. But I think the thing that I wanted to just discuss is that, we don't really have free speech in these sort of organizations. If you want to find free speech, you got to get out of these power structures. But, we have issues right now. Like, I think the other thing was with the Charlie Kirk assassination, you have these individuals who, you had a lot of people, like I mentioned before, just saying absolutely crazy things and diabolical things, celebrating his death. And it looked, it's kind of a reflection of a large amount of evil in our society that occurs. And, these people are employed by organizations, and these organizations are like, oh man, like, what do we have? Because it's coming. What do we have in our employer base? And I think, and how is this going to impact us? And it's just fascinating to see that right now. And they also see how organizations respond. I mean, I'm sure, if you work for an organization, you might have gotten HR or someone else might have sent a reminder email to try to avoid, getting the organization into large political conflict, and I don't. It's just an interesting thing. I think obviously you don't want to say anything crazy. I mean, it should be obvious, but maybe it's not. That, like, you shouldn't celebrate somebody's death, and you shouldn't do that. Not just to not get fired. You just shouldn't. It's just if you celebrate it, you're just unwell mentally. Your mental health is not well if you're celebrating death of any individual who, really of any individual, I'd argue. But I mean, especially true of people who are nonviolent. Where, freedom of speech still is, I think freedom of speech for all of us is something that's going to be a real challenge in the future. And I think not just in terms of the government, but in terms of organizations, because I think there's more and more dependence of organizations on government for a lot of things in terms of where we are going from a macroeconomic perspective. Organizations, especially healthcare organizations, are entirely dependent on Medicare and Medicaid. And, I think more and more so, that's their bottom line in terms of reimbursement is largely affected by that. So, I think political influence and political power is going to be more and more a part of, politics, of our day-to-day business. And it's going to be hard to separate, organizations from politics. And, I think there's going to be some encouragement to be politically active, but then not get into political trouble. And, that's going to be a real challenge. I think fundamentally, others have said this, but I'll say it. I can't think of government as anything more than a organization that claims legitimacy of the initiation of use of force on others. I'll say that again. Governments cannot be distinguished by anything other than a group or organization that claims legitimacy of the initiation of use of force on others. And when you have the capacity to initiate force on others, you inherently, there's a gun in the room. You inherently have the capacity for violence, the legitimacy of capacity for violence. Whenever you're dealing with anything that's going to inflict force on others, you're going to upset people. You're going to get individuals upset. You're going to have conflict, and it's at the start of it is how money is transferred from individual to individual, how the law is used against people who are acting non-violently, and this is just going to create more and more conflict. And we have to continue to be able to talk about this and not be afraid. I think with where we're going, I think with organizations that might be coming down on your ability to speak freely about things that have something to do with politics, like that's going to be problematic, because politics is all about what is legitimate or not legitimate in terms of initiating force on others. My opinion, I don't think this is where I am as sort of a I don't think there is legitimacy of initiating the use of force on others. That's a topic for another day. But when you're dealing with that, of course you're gonna always be dealing with conflict, and you can't avoid that. And we have to find a way of not being. We have to find a way of being able to speak freely, even when there's pressure not to. Because if you're not able to speak freely and you work for organizations, you're turning into a robot, right? You're slowly turning into a robot. You're not saying anything. You're only doing tasks. You're not creating solutions and creating conjecture to observations you see. You're simply completing tasks. And what can do that really well is artificial intelligence. So you're ending up becoming a robot if you can't speak freely. If you cannot speak freely in what you do, you are becoming a robot. And in a world of emerging and improving artificial intelligence, it is you're going to get replaced, because you have nothing else to offer. You have nothing else to offer if you can't speak freely. What separates us from artificial intelligence at present, our current form of artificial intelligence, what separates human beings is the ability to create conjecture, the ability to develop ideas, the ability to create explanatory models of observations that we see. We can watch activity and think about we can see something in the world and then generate an idea of what explains it, and then go on and test how well that explanatory model is. I'm walking by the canal here. I can see, if I see a blip of turbulence come out of the water in a small area, I can create a conjecture that a fish might have popped out and created those ripples, or a bird just came by and swooped up a fish, and I can think about that, and I can look up in the sky and look for the bird, or look down in the water and see if there's a fish swimming away, or a school of fish, and try to explain that model better. I take my observations, and then I try to create an explanatory model, and then do additional observations or tests to figure it out. That is what is fundamentally human, but you have to be able to express that. You have to be able to express your model, express your hypotheses, say what you're going to do with it. And what we do with political commentary or any sort of social commentary is that we're observing things and we're trying to develop explanatory models of what we see. And if somebody's threatened by that or doesn't want us to say something that might be accurate yet provocative, we don't get to do what fundamentally makes us human. We don't get to do what we're best at. We are no more different than any artificial intelligence robot. So freedom of speech is absolutely at the core of what makes us human. We have to find ways of really protecting this as best as we can, because if we don't, we are not anything different than artificial intelligence. We have to create conjecture, we have to explain models, we have to explain observations, whether it's scientific, whether it's social, whether it's ethical, whether it's philosophical. We have to be able to do that, and any constraint that anyone puts on us on that is going to restrict us from being what we truly are and what makes us unique in this universe. So I think those are my thoughts for today. If you like this, please, if you like this, please, if you're looking at this on YouTube, give me a like and a subscribe to my channel. If you're looking at this on Nostr, stats are always appreciated. I hope you have a great day.